visited by students.
Rich people in Europe sent their children to Druid colleges. That's well affirmed, in Ireland as well as in mainland Britain. And we do know that these people came to Britain with a specific function, which is that the education they got here was obviously worth having.
At the time of Christ, Britain was not a primitive backwater. It was at the forefront of scholarship and the study of the natural sciences. For instance, some modern studies of Britain's stone circles have described them as sophisticated solar and lunar observatories capable of predicting such rare astronomical events as eclipses and the lunar standstill.
We've got objective evidence going back possibly beyond 3000 BC. And then, of course, this Stonehenge, which is, although it's a unique construction, draws favourably on geometry and draws favourably on the units of length used in its construction, which are all commensurate with units of length that we either have today or which were used in Egypt and Rome and Greece. Indeed, in terms of navigation, we still use the Greek foot today, on which Stonehenge is largely based. If you were to go to the middle of Stonehenge, this lintel circle exists at a certain distance. The outer Aubrey circle, which was a set of chalk pits about a metre across, there are 56 of them in a circle. That was built 3000 BC about. The ratio between the radius of the Sarsen circle and the radius of the Aubrey circle is in exact proportion to the foot royal cubit megalithic yard ratio. So this would be the foot. The Aubrey circle would be the megalithic yard, and the difference would be the royal cubit. And this has profound meanings for astronomers, because the foot to the royal cubit is the same as the overrun of the lunar year to the solar year, exactly to the length of the lunar month.
To put it another way, from new moon through full moon to new moon again is a lunar month, and 12 months make a lunar year. From solstice to solstice, the solar year is just that bit longer, so that one solar year is equal to 12.37 lunar months. That extra bit is the lunar overrun. And interestingly, a lunar month is in the same ratio to the lunar overrun as the royal cubit is to the foot, and it's a ratio which matches the ground plan of Stonehenge.
So put me in Stonehenge with a rope, and quite quickly, by tying a little knot underneath the Sarsen circle, you can make a solar lunar calendar and calibrate the year in terms of the lunar phases in a matter of 10 minutes, 20 minutes.
But how does the mathematics of Britain's ancient sites link up with the sacred geometry of the Bible? There's one intriguing and irrefutable connection: the Book of Enoch, one of the Jewish sacred texts which, while not today part of the Old Testament, is attributed to a character from Genesis, Enoch, who lived 364 years, and is quoted in the New Testament. Several copies of the Book of Enoch were found amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it was clearly one of the sacred books of the Essenes.
Enoch's journey is very interesting, because no one really knows who Enoch is, I don't think, if it's one person or if it's a collection of knowledge. But Enoch arrives and goes and talks to an angel who flies off with a cord up north. It says so in the Book of Enoch, and he goes, "Why are you going off north with these ropes and cords?" And the angel says, "We're going off to measure." So he goes off north, and then he describes this amazing process of, he actually gives us some astrophysics, which is very unusual for the period. He tells us exactly where the sun rises, the length of the day and night for each month of the year. And when you worked out from the day-night ratio, the latitude on the Earth, Enoch wasn't in the Middle East. He wasn't even up in Greece or even in southern France. It was done at the latitude coinciding with Britain. This doesn't mean it happened in Britain, and the temple with the portals that he describes doesn't necessarily have to be British. But the fact is, we do have a temple in Britain that was already built, which does have portals, and if you were to stand right at the sharp end of the horseshoe here and look through these portals, Enoch's description fits very closely with what you would observe.
In some fields of calculation, mathematicians 2,000 years ago knew as much about the solar system and the Earth as we know today. They not only knew the Earth was round, they knew how big it was.
Ptolemy gives it us, Pliny gives it us, a number of other sources from the same period as Enoch give it to. They give us the meridian circumference in the units of the day, and they give us the polar radius in the units of the day. And when you actually work out, using the units of the day, what size that represents, all the GPS and all the satellite surveying of this planet, we're only a matter of 100 feet out in 4,000 miles. And the meridian circumference is the same today in our navigational equipment as described by Ptolemy in his 8-part treatise Geographia in 140 AD or whenever he wrote it. These numbers exist and they're there and they can be checked. And when you do check them, you find that they knew the size of the Earth and the shape.
To the Druids, mathematics was the language they used to describe much of what they studied and observed. And they found numbers incorporated within the geometry of the stone circles. Jews and Greeks studied gematria, the meaning of numbers within the written language. All three groups saw mathematics as both a practical and sacred science. In the ancient world, astronomers were also astrologers. Not surprisingly, the early Christians were fascinated by numbers and sacred calculations. Even the name of Jesus was given a mystical value.
His name is Yehoshua HaMashiach, which is the name that the Messianic Christians in Israel give him to this day. Joshua, the Anointed One. The number of Joshua is 64, which is 8 squared or 4 cubed. Now, square and cube numbers, according to Plato, are the perfections of that number. And so you get into the meaning of the number 4 and the meaning of the number 8, both of which are very important in symbolism. And the total comes to 121, which is 11 squared. And Plato says that square numbers have a direct relation to justice. Well, justice is very important, and you get it in the New Testament, the just one. Jesus is the just one, and that's a huge area of philosophy.
And in Greek,
he's called Jesus Christos. But the numbers there are very interesting because Jesus is 888 and Christos is 1480. Now, in terms of ratio, Jesus is 3 times 296 and Christos is 5 times 296, which means the ratio between them is 3 to 5. And if you take Jesus Christos as a whole word, Jesus Christ, then that would be 8 times 296. So you've got the ratio 3 to 5 to 8. Now these are Fibonacci numbers, and they approximate to the divine proportion.
Yet another clue that the early Greek, Roman and Jewish Christians, like the Druids, used numbers to speak about nature and God as creator. For Fibonacci numbers, those in the sequence 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, and so on, occur everywhere in the natural world. In the petals of flowers, branches of trees, musical scales, and spiralling of climbing plants. The number sequence is embedded in nature. When shown like this, one square building on another, a spiral can be drawn, just like the spiral to be found in a snail shell or sunflower head.
It's as though they were saying, this guy, Jesus Christos, is the embodiment of the life force, the principle of chi in the East, the life energy of the whole universe. And of course that is what Christians came to believe, but it's there in the numerology.
The ancient world was fascinated with coding, and gematria and numerology are one way of doing it. But to say that somebody's name resolves to 7 and that tells you something about the person is something that science can't recognise and doesn't know how to get a handle on it.
When you say all things are connected through number, geometry, music, cosmology, it's all too much. And leading compartmentalised lives, particularly with modern theories of knowledge and science, it's just not on.
The Fibonacci numbers are also used to find the divine proportion, the perfect shape, the one used by classical architects, which is still commonly used by designers today. The proportion of 1 to 1.6 is even the standard shape of the ubiquitous plastic card. Yet to fully appreciate how numbers, astronomy and geometry have been used for sacred purposes, one only has to explore a medieval cathedral. Chartres in France is full of clues. Zodiacs, Pythagorean geometry, and representations of the solar year. And the whole structure is built up on a ground plan which has evolved from the geometry commonly found in ancient stone circles from Cornwall to Scotland. It's formed from 2 intersecting circles, with another enclosing them both, and the arc of a 4th circle completing the distinctive flattened shape. But the central feature of the geometry is the shape known as the Vesica Pisces, which matches the Chartres ground plan and forms the early Christian symbol of the fish.
Geometry was very important in the ancient world, and the tradition of Plato stressed geometry, and the fact that geometry, as its name implies, modelled the universe. And sacred architecture was thought of as being a symbolic representation of the cosmos through its proportions.
And the Bible contains several strange passages which can only be understood in the context of sacred geometry. For instance, this Gospel story tells of Jesus' third appearance to his 12 disciples after his resurrection, the occasion when Peter caught 153 fish. Using the theorem attributed to Pythagoras, 3 squared plus 12 squared is equal to 153, and the square root of 153 is 12.37, which, interestingly, is the ratio of the lunar year to the solar year.
It's not hard to see that Jesus could have been thought of as the earthly counterpart of the maker of the heavens. And in one of the letters of the early church about Glastonbury, it says that it was built by the maker of the heavens, the fabricator caelorum, and it gives a very strong analogy with Jesus being the earthly counterpart of the one through whom all things were made, which of course Christians still believe, and there's good biblical justification for that.
But over time, the mathematical secrets of the Bible were forgotten. The knowledge faded away along with much of the accumulated wisdom of the ancient world.
It does seem to me very strange that the number coding, which you find explicitly in the 12 apostles, the 40 days in the wilderness and this type of thing, and the esoteric numbering within the alphabet, that alpha being 1, beta being 2, etc., and also in the Hebrew, that does seem to fade away quite quickly.
Number got divorced from quality and became purely quantitative. Now that process happened in Britain, certainly. There were articles written by Thomas and various other mathematicians that said that basically we've turned mathematics into the numbers of the counting house. Before that period, number had quality, and geometry and number were totally interlinked.
Through tracing the Druid, Roman, Jewish and Greek connections, Gordon Strachan found Jesus was a far more universal figure than he once supposed. Jesus could be seen as coming to fulfill not just the Jewish Old Testament, but the Old Testaments of other cultures as well. The Druids had their own myths, for instance, involving the coming of a Redeemer.
Druid seers saying, we've been waiting for this. If Jesus is who Christians think he was, then he has to be universal. He has to be universal. And he has to fit all cultures. The Jews and the Christians on the whole follow the more puritanical and narrow side of the Bible. And they leave out what we call the wisdom tradition. And the wisdom tradition is much more universal, it's much more soft edge, it's much more to do with intuition and with things that are thought of as marginal by mainstream signed up Jews and Christians.
But the ancient knowledge had not been entirely forgotten. It resurfaced in medieval times, both in architecture and in story. The Glastonbury legends were told again, though by this time they were mixed up with stories of King Arthur and the Holy Grail. One of these legends claimed that the first church, possibly built by the Lord himself, contained within it a secret awaiting discovery.
William of Malmesbury says that there was a code in the layout, in the geometry of the stone slabs of the early chapel, and he says that this is a secret of the Lord, and some people have thought that it did represent a zodiac, or it represented symbols to do with the zodiac and astrology. It seems strange that we don't know. The secret might well have referred in symbol to the fact that it had been built by Jesus, or indeed by Joseph of Arimathea. Why was it a secret? Because by the time these legends became important, the Church of Rome had taken over, and you weren't allowed to disagree with the Church of Rome. So any vestige of the early British Church would have been condemned. It could only have been communicated through symbol. I had the feeling that there probably was some sort of cover-up, and it wasn't until the 12th century that you got the stories of Joseph, or possibly Jesus, having come here, coming out. And I could think that the Anglo-Saxon Christians probably didn't get on terribly well with the original Celtic Christians. If the Danish Christians were here, they probably didn't get on with the Anglo-Saxons. And the Normans came in and blitzed everything, really. So I could think that there was a political motive for these legends having been marginalised and thought of as being really unimportant.
Gordon Strachan's conjecture that Jesus did indeed come to England to discover the roots of Pythagorean spirituality and to be educated in the ancient wisdom can never be proved. But in exploring the Glastonbury legend, Gordon Strachan has rediscovered a lost tradition of ancient spirituality, one which is all around us if we only know where to look.
It doesn't change if I knew he had gone to England or if I knew he had gone to India. That certainly would not change my vision of him as the Son of God and the Saviour, not in any way. And I don't think it's offensive to his humanity that he should have sought knowledge, because I do think, like the rest of us, he had to struggle to discern his vocation. Like he lived through what I would call a temporary vocation as a disciple of John the Baptist, before realizing that his mission was not to be the assistant of a prophet or even a prophet, but to be the Messiah. I think Jesus came to that conviction himself. So that this sort of intellectual struggle, then I would see, if someone wishes to say, well, he diversified into literature, mathematics, culture in general, music, I see no problem at all. To me, that would enhance his humanity rather than diminish his humanity.
I personally have found it very freeing, because the God and the Christ who I was taught to believe in was too small. And I've had some interesting feedback, because some people who'd lost their faith because they find the church is just switches them off, have said to me now, if I can really trust this understanding of Jesus, then it is inclusive. Without robbing Jesus of his uniqueness, it's still inclusive. And of course, I'm really peddling a form of Christian Platonism. That's really what it's about, Christian Pythagoreanism. And people who don't like that, and the church often hasn't liked that, will be upset. But those who've really missed the link with culture and the link with the world, the link with creation at a very profound level, they will love it. And so far, the response has been very positive indeed.